you for coming to today's session on understanding poverty. My name is Chuck Putney, and I wear this because the glare from the lights doesn't work for my eyes, so I apologize. This program is being co-sponsored by the Bennington branch of the American Association of University Women and by the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Bennington. We are longtime partners in community programming, and I will mention that we have additional programs coming up in the beginning of January on the Constitution, on hate speech in a free speech society, and another program on poverty, pathways to prosperity. So keep your eye out. We'll send out notes about those meetings. Today, we're very pleased to have two people with a lot of expertise and a lot of strong perspectives on the field of poverty. Naomi Miller, who has taught social work and issues relating to poverty for years, and has served as a consultant to a variety of agencies in New Jersey and elsewhere on issues of poverty. And then Sue Andrews, many of you will know from her works at Greater Bennington Interfaith Community Services, has a long career working in public health and issues relating to poverty. And they may say more about themselves when they get up here, but we are very pleased to have them both, and very pleased you're all here with us today. And by the way, pleased that Cat TV is taping this and will be putting it on their Facebook page and YouTube page at some point in the near future. So we very much appreciate Cat TV's participation in this. So I don't know whether Naomi is starting or Sue, so I will let them take it over.
Hi. We're going to go back and forth. Welcome. Thanks to all of you for coming. We're going to go back and forth between here and the drawing space. I just want to say, first of all, that we are aware that we have some wonderfully strong competition at 3 o'clock, musical at the second Congo, and we will make sure to have a natural pause at a time that allows those who are going to go to the second Congo to leave.
I hope I can arrive.
So, there are things that we all, oh, I'm Naomi, by the way. Hi, I'm Naomi, that's Sue. You all know Sue, so that's, there are things we all know, like that income inequality exists and it's a really serious problem, right? But there are different ways of knowing something. And we're really unlikely to say anything today that everyone here doesn't already know. What we really just hope to do is to frame what we all know in ways that allow us all to act together to whatever extent we can. So, how you know something affects your attitude towards it, which in turn affects your behavior. We two both go back and forth in our approaches to poverty, as I think everybody does on some level, between structural approaches and relational approaches. We consider them equally important, and we're going to be winding back and forth between them as we talk today. When we say structural, we basically mean the vast inequality in income wealth needs to be changed, plain and simple. Needs to be changed. Right now, the top 1% of people in the United States own 32% of the wealth, which means the rest of us are fighting over the rest. But the bottom 52% own 3.2% of the wealth. So 50% of us are struggling over 3.2% of the available resources, basically. We can contrast this to Denmark, which I do often in my mind, and I looked it up this morning, where right now the average tax rate is 45%, and where they reliably come up with the highest happiness measure in the world. So, I mean, I just like to imagine if our very rich people paid 45% of their incomes towards providing free health care for all of us, free tuition and a $900 a month stipend to students up through graduate school, free nursing home care. You know, it would be a very different picture. And while there would still be rich people here, there would not be people who were poor in the way that we understand poverty here and now. By relational approaches to poverty, we mean that in order to create the social will to make those kinds of structural changes happen, those in the comfortable classes have to change our attitudes towards people living in poverty. So we need to consistently feel each other's humanity. And we need to respect each other's struggles and decisions so that the change feels urgent and pressing, which it is apparently not feeling because we're not making it happen. The people in Ukraine right now, they need our country's support, and we're making sure they get it. But the people living in poverty in Bennington also need our country's support, and we need to make sure they get it too, right? With the same sense of urgency. We're sending blankets to Ukraine. Yeah. It feels urgent. So we want to talk about how can we make sure that that happens about poverty in our own environs. And I'm passing it on to Sue.
So this marker is not very good. Sheila just marked. Thank you all for coming. So nice to see faces that I haven't seen in 2.5 or more years. So I wanted to start by saying that Mary Oliver's 1992 poem, The Summer Day, ends with the well-known lines, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Probably those lines are better known than the poem itself, but I have always focused on those 2 lines. While the poem itself is her reflection on being one with nature, and it involves a grasshopper and holding a grasshopper in her hand and just enjoying a moment. And she talks about not taking life for granted. When I first read that poem, really took it as a charge to action to do what I can about making justice issues better here on earth. The Reverend Martin Luther King said it best, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. So one of the questions I wanted to raise to you, to all of us, is why should we care about poverty? And why should we try to intervene? And should our interventions be structural or relational, or both? And we're going to explore these questions with you today as we go forward. So data shows that people who live in and near poverty have worse health outcomes. And I see we have the good Dr. Dundas with us, so he has seen this firsthand. I'll look at that diagram later. But we have people in poverty have worse health outcomes. They have lesser educational achievement. They are less productive. They have more mental health and more addiction issues. Looking at these problems through my lens of trying to make life better for people who live in poor socioeconomic conditions, the answer to me, and I have to say, I have a degree in public health with a focus on maternal child health, so this has always been my first love. The answer lies in making life better for our children, so that they will have the best opportunity to become productive citizens. So some of you may have caught a piece on the radio yesterday. Trying to think of the title of it. Anyway, it was a TED Talk. I guess it was on the TED Radio Hour. They had a scientist named Kimberly Noble. And she talked about, as we well know, there's extremely rapid brain development from the time a baby is born for the first 36 to 40 months. Just amazing. Babies, regardless of whether they're born poor or born wealthy or born somewhere in between, are born with about 100 billion brain cells. Kind of a hard number to get your mind around. Starting on day one, they generate between 250,000 and 500,000 additional brain cells every minute.
Whoa.
It's amazing to think of the machine that's going on up here. More important than that number of cells during those 3 years is the fact that the baby's brains are building connections between the cells, synapses, neural connections. When kids are born, there's very few connections between these, this very large number, this 100 billion cells. But by the age of 3, the brain has developed, now this is a hard number to wrap your head around, 1,000 trillion connections between and among brain cells. So no wonder we see our brains as the most complex 3 pounds of stuff in the universe. One of my kids in particular is really into artificial intelligence, and you can't even think about going there when you see stuff like this. So what Noble has found is that there's a direct correlation between family income and the size of the brain's surface area, or the cerebral cortex, which is the it's what you think of when you think of the brain, the crinkly stuff that kind of covers it. And on average, and that's the part of the brain that does the heavy lifting for cognitive kinds of things. And on average, higher family income is associated with larger brain surface. The difference in the size of the brain results in a dramatic difference in school readiness that follows children throughout life. The gap may narrow as they proceed through life, but it continues to persist. By the time kids reach the age for kindergarten, kids born in poverty have a 60% lower cognitive score on average than their more fortunate peers. They are 5 times more likely to drop out of high school. And for those who manage to get through high school, they're less likely to earn a college degree. But probably most stunning of all is that by the age of 35, a child born into poverty is 75 times more likely to be poor herself than her peer who was born into a more reasonable situation. So Noble's continuing to do some work, and I won't get into it except to say that her working hypothesis in her current research is that families with higher incomes have less stress in their households. Not just perceived stress, like, oh, I feel so stressed out today, I'm feeling anxious, but stress that can be measured quantitatively through biological testing. And specifically, she's looking at biological assays of the amount of cortisol in the hair shafts of the parents and comparing them across this spectrum. She has 1,000 people in this study that she's doing, so 1,000 families. And the actual hair shafts of the families who live in poverty contain much higher levels of cortisol, which has been made by the body and kind of grows into that hair shaft. And her theory is that stress may be a pathway to the poor outcomes for people who live in poverty. So the policy implications here are huge. We're trying to go back and forth, but be aware of time. So I'll just end this part by saying that with this information, we need to understand that by the time a kid gets to kindergarten, it's too late. It is too late. So we really need to think whether it's structural changes or relational changes. We need to think about the fact that it's too late by the age of 5. We have to be doing something major from day 1. So.
I just want to listen to her talk. So I'm going to jump back to the unequal distribution of resources and just try to flesh it out a little bit more and how people get into this situation of poverty. So to frame that, I always think about the unequal distribution of resources. I was saying before what the top 1% hold. The top 10%, which includes a lot of people in this room probably, holds 70% of the resources. And that's a figure that can make you think, oh gee, all of us in this room, like we need to change our lives and give something up. But it's not so much like that. The 9% of people who are between the 90 and the 99% marks, right, actually hold 36% of the resources. So if you imagine that as that group of people would need to reduce, this is roughly speaking, right, but would need to reduce their resources by something vaguely around a third in exchange for not only increased equality everywhere, but presumably for all the conditions that would, of social welfare provision that would be providing the supports for the children Sue was just talking about as well. So I'm saying this because one of the first things we talked about when we started talking about this program was how difficult it is for resourced folks like us to think about redistribution without the gut level fear of what would that mean for my life. And so I wanted to put it out there right in the front that actually that's not really the issue. The issue is the very wealthy. That's the issue. And that's who we ought to keep thinking about talking to about this, if anybody knows any of them. So how do people get into poverty? This is getting to attitudes, right? We have to change our attitudes across class lines. We have to understand each other's experiences if we're going to feel urgent about each other's needs. Yeah? And the biggest thing in terms of how people end up in poverty is lack of jobs. I mean, that's the meta issue. And poverty, as we know it, is the result of certain conditions that have been in effect since the Industrial Revolution and its link with a capitalist economic system that leave swaths of people unemployed in certain areas at certain times. So that's the major meta cause of poverty. But then if we get to smaller levels, more individual levels of how do people find themselves falling into those swaths of people, right, who are living in these conditions that Sue was just expanding on with her kids. In relative order of prevalence, it's people being born into the circumstance of poverty, divorce, which leaves women and children in poverty, becoming physically disabled, developing a chronic mental illness, and developing a drug and or alcohol dependence or addiction. And that's the sort of relative order of how people fall into poverty. So since being born into poverty is the really biggest category there, I'm going to follow up a little on what Sue was just sort of outlining in the physiological sense, in the social realm. So the primary effect on children, if you think of it in the social realm, is in the educational achievement area. It's not mysterious, and it's not only stress. There are some very practical things, like that kids who were living with parents who were not educationally encouraged and successful do not have somebody to comfortably help them with their homework. Kids who are living in a crowded circumstance often don't have a place that's quiet enough to do their homework. Currently, we have an enormous problem about the internet access and computer divergence, right? So people who don't have access to internet and computers are really left behind in the educational system, profoundly. And then there's the absence of monetary capital. Not just what you need to clothe and feed and protect your kids on a monthly basis, but having extra to provide them with as a stopgap something, or knowing somebody who does. So if you don't have enough money, if your family doesn't have enough money to loan you money if you're a couple of $100 short on the rent, you lose your apartment. If your family doesn't have the resources to bail you out if you happen to get arrested for some minor infringement, you're going to stay there until you're arraigned, or in some cases until you're tried. And during that time, you could lose your job, your apartment, your children, right? And there's this big thing about just a little extra capital in the family network, which is the access to a car and car insurance. Unless you happen to live in a major metropolitan area, the big thing is, we all know this, right? I'm just saying what we all know. How can you work if you don't have a car? How can you have a car if you don't have a job? And it goes round and round. And it's very basic in this neighborhood. In the absence of these things, and in the absence of the connections that go with the social capital of middle class and upper class life, people rely on networks of reciprocity. So people rely on being able to borrow their friend's car. They rely on friends picking up their kids if they were held at the police station, etc. Networks of reciprocity in which people jump forward to support each other and are in turn responsible to jump forward for the people who jumped forward for them. And we'll talk about this again a bit later. That's where I'm passing it back to Sue.
Many of you may remember the, what was it called? Something out of poverty. Bridges out of poverty that we had here in Bennington several times over the last 20 years. And some of the stuff that Naomi was just speaking about is very reminiscent of the material that was presented there. I wanted to talk briefly about health and the human organism and the community organism and what makes us healthy or not. When I was in grad school, which is getting to be a longer and longer time ago, there was a fellow who taught at Berkeley, where I did my public health degree, who was well known in Canada for his work on what he called the social determinants of health. His name was Heinrich Bloom, and he actually left the faculty the year before I came on, but he had had a powerful influence. So anybody who knows me has probably seen me pull out at meetings determinants of health cartoon, as it were.
Is that the original?
Yes, if you'd like to, we made a slightly enlarged one. So the point I want to make is that, and there's one thing missing here, is that health is in the middle of all this. So as we entered the middle part of the last century and started thinking about things like insurance and making sure that people had access to medical services and all that kind of thing, people like Dr. Bloom realized, based on real life, that actually, sorry Dr. D, medical services have far less of an impact on people's health than does these other things. So in this cartoon, you see that 4 things have been identified as having an impact. Do we have a, I guess I can do this. Nope, that's not going to work. There. Okay. So we have these things that impact on our health. We have medical services, we have genetics, or the complement with which we're born, behavior, smoking, obesity, whether you get out and walk in the morning, that kind of thing, and environment. And this is a little bit out of relationship for impacts in terms of which things have the biggest impact. Medical services basically have been determined to have about 5% of the overall impact on health. So while access to medical services is extremely important, it's important to recognize that other things have a much bigger impact. Genetics is something that we can't really do much about, at least in the moment. You're born with what you're born with. And genetics does have a certain impact on health. But the 2 things that have the biggest impact are behavior, good behavior, bad behavior, the things you do to keep yourself healthy. But biggest of all is environment. And who can say what's the biggest part of environment? I mean, we're talking about it here. It's socioeconomic status and what you have access to. So these determinants have a huge impact on the person, the individual organism, and their behavior. And as noted earlier, socioeconomic status has a huge impact on the development of the human brain. But then the next step of this, and I did not learn this from Dr. Blum, this is the theory of Sue Andrews, it begins to affect our community. And I think we are really seeing that in Bennington in a way that is even worse than when I was working for GPICS a couple of years ago. Seeing things like the rise in crime, the recent rise in crime, the presence of guns, you know, the ongoing tragedy of drug addiction and substance abuse and that kind of thing. We are really seeing our community circling the drain. And I'm talking specifically about Bennington, about downtown Bennington. We have a high rate of poverty here, and we know it. There's really good data. Everybody and his brother collects data. But what is less obvious, I think, is how very close, not just those people in poverty, but the rest of us lived to the poverty line and the impact that has on our community. And Naomi has mentioned the very rich. Well, you know, maybe there's a few of the very rich here in Bennington, but by and large, we're pretty normal people. So some of our statistics have the impact of pulling our numbers in the wrong direction. I think the mathematical term is regression to the mean. Bill, is that right? But we here in Bennington, in the town of Bennington, not the outskirts, not the outlying town, but this little tiny town, we have poverty statistics that rival, that are on a par with poverty statistics in Mississippi, Louisiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, all these places that we hear about that are real horror shows. But our little insular community has those problems. The state of Vermont is slightly better off, but right here we have a major issue. We have a dramatically different poverty rate than the rest of the state. 20.7% of people living in poverty, people living in Bennington live in poverty, compared to the rest of the state at 11.4%. More than 30% of our kids under the age of 17 live in poverty. That's a third of all our kids. More than half of the kids qualify for free lunch. Our graduation rate, which had improved for a while but now is kind of slowing down again, is only 78%. So for every 100 kids that go into the high school, 22 don't make it out. The stat for the state of Vermont is 91.4%. You might say, oh, those numbers aren't that far apart, but it really, when you think of the implications it has for kids' lives, they really are. Our MAU, Mount Anthony High School, is rated 37th out of 55 high schools, public high schools in Vermont.
On what measure? On poverty or
on graduation rate.
Graduation rate.
Yeah. There's a study that's done nationally, and it's carried out every other year among kids of certain ages. There's a 6th to 8th grade cohort and a 9th to 12th grade cohort called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And unfortunately, because of COVID, the most recent results are not yet available. But hearkening back to the study previously, which I think is dated 2021 for data collected in 2020, 37% of our high school students at the high school indicated that they felt sad or hopeless on this study. And this is a self-reported study, and they do work on the study to make sure that they're getting valid, correct, true answers. The kids are being honest. 43% of our high school kids smoke. 43%. It's unbelievable in an era when we know so much about the impact of tobacco on health. We have a higher than state average of overweight and obesity. And people always say, so if they're poor, why are they overweight? Well, the reality is people eat empty calories when they're overweight, when they're poor. There's a lot of stuff they eat that gives you fuel, but it doesn't give you a lot of nutritional bang for the buck. I think the stat that has always shocked me the most here is that 1/3 of our high school students have some kind of disability, either physical, emotional, or learning disability. That's 1/3 of all the kids we have at Mount Anthony. And 41% do not participate in any after-school activities. So these are just kind of raw things, just to paint a picture. And there's certainly other good things out there. We can talk about the kids from the better off families who, you know, take AP courses and all that kind of stuff. But this is a fairly bleak slice for those who are living in poverty. I think the statistics for adults are clear, but less obvious to those of us who just live our day-to-day life here. Our overall population rate among adults is 13.2%. The median household income in Bennington is $46,000, and I'm going to take the liberty of rounding off here. $46,000 compared to the national median household income of $65,000. In 1971, 61% of Americans lived in the middle class. Today, less than half of the US population lives in the middle class. And middle class can be defined in various ways, but basically sort of an arithmetic way to approach it is to look at the poverty level and then say everybody who has between 200 and 400% of the income of those living in poverty is going to be our middle class. But basically, think about this and look around the room and see your friends and think about the people you know in the community. In the US, the middle income for household of one is, or to be in the middle class, is between $30,000 and $90,000 per year. How many families of one do each of us know in this area that come nowhere near $30,000, never mind $90,000 per year? Some of this is invisible. A family of four is similar. The median national income for a household of four is $98,000. And the range to be in the middle class goes between $67,000 and $201,000. How many four-person households in Bennington do each of us know or that we're aware of who fit into this definition? My theory is that there are many, many more that are sliding off that lower edge and don't even make it onto the screen. And the sad thing is, or I don't know, maybe that's the wrong way to put it, if you ask man on the street, if I asked everybody in this room, you know, what class do you think you're in? Most people say, I live in the middle class. But the reality is the middle class lifestyle of having a place to live, of having a car so that you can get to your appointments is really slipping beyond the grasp of many, many people. A couple other stats I want to share, going back to the number of kids in high school who have disabilities. 30%, almost 1/3 of adults living in Bennington are on disability. That is significantly higher than the state average of 24%, which is significantly higher than the national average. Again, that's just part of painting this picture. Significant number are overweight, are obese. And I think the thing that's scary is almost 20% of adults, when asked, how is your health, rate their health as only poor or fair. And that's right here in Bennington. So in a nutshell, the health of the individuals affects the health of our community. I think we're in a downward spiral. I think the heaviness of the load of poverty that we have in Bennington is pulling down life as we know it. If you go on some of these Facebook feeds in the evening and you look at how many cars are getting broken into in Bennington every single night of the week. Petty crime, it's such an indicator of people not having enough. So I'll end by just saying that moving up and out of poverty requires more than a stream of income. It requires a reservoir of personal and community assets. And if our community is not strong, we cannot raise strong children.
So that's a lot to absorb, right? And yet it isn't anything that any of us can probably say we didn't know. So how is it that we can know things and not know them, see them but not see them? And I think of that as the question we need to ask ourselves if we're going to get ourselves to be able to see them and know them. How is it that we don't see? How is it that we don't know what we know? And one of the things I think that's very important in that is that we don't see something if we don't understand what it is. So that's sort of the basic thing of perception, you know, and in this we're like most mammals. I was thinking this morning about dogs who, you know, if they, cats do it too, if they hear an unfamiliar sound, before taking action in relation to it, they do that keep thing with their ears. And they try to understand what the sound means. And at a certain point they decide, oh, that's a mouse behind the wood stove, I have to go, get it, right? Or they decide that's an irrelevant human noise and they go back to sleep. But they don't move until they have understood what it is. They need the context, they need to know what it is. And that's one of the major things in really seeing what is in front of us, is understanding it. And in order to see what other people's lives are manifesting, to really see it, we have to understand what we're seeing, right? So somebody said to me recently, somebody who lives in Shaftesbury said to me, to my surprise, there's no poverty in Shaftesbury. And I said, wow, don't you like drive along 7A? Don't you drive north on East Road sometimes? Yeah, I don't see any poverty. And I've been thinking a lot about what was it that person doesn't see? And I think in part, you know, we don't see things that upset us. We don't see things that may make us feel guilty. We don't see things that we don't know what to do about. But also, I think there's a lot of signs of poverty in a house when you're passing it that people may not know because they haven't made connections with, friendships with, relationships of some kind, with people who live in those homes. You know? And so to build relationships across class is not only about being able to reach out and help people, but it's equally importantly, to my mind, about understanding the conditions under which somebody is living in a way that you don't if you don't have an actual relationship with them. Go into their house and understand what makes their house as it is. Yeah? And not Once you go in and you understand, then you see things you wouldn't have seen that are actually markers of poverty. So a big question, I think, really is, how can we form relationships across class? And this is actually where we were going to change the order.
Okay.
I was just going to ask people to think about, to give a moment's thought before Sue gets up and starts to talk again, about what interferes with your having relationships with people who are significantly poorer than you, from whatever level you're coming to it from. To just give it a moment to kind of hold that in your mind. And to think about the relationships you have had across class in any direction, up or down from you, and to hold those in your mind. Because those are things of hope. Those are things those are capacities that we need to hold in our minds. As Sue talks about radical hospitality.
So anybody who knows me and knows my work at GBICS, one of the things we talked about all the time at GBICS was radical hospitality. And I was thinking today, how do you describe what that means? And there's actually a couple of people here who were associated with GBICS in one way or another over the 14 years that I was there, and maybe they can put it in words better than I can, but I guess you could say that radical hospitality, and this is in an organization, but also in our personal lives, is the practice of putting extraordinary effort and emphasis on making people feel welcome. So it puts the emphasis on breaking down barriers that prevent people from participating in any kind of an effort or a campaign or a community. I always think of, again, I think it's MLK, our beloved community. And I think that at GBICS, we always said to our patients, our guests, the people who took our classes, we are the community. It wasn't about, a team of people doing something to some people who lived in poverty. We really tried to establish some mutuality, and I know that Naomi's going to talk more about mutuality, but again, MLK says a network of mutuality. How do you enter into relationships where you're not being paternalistic or maternalistic? I always think of Dr. Dundas one night at our clinic, who late in the evening was seeing a fellow who lived outside, and the guy was inebriated slightly, and he came in with his dog, and the dog was not the best behaved dog in the world. But my memory is that Dr. Dundas conducted the medical visit while holding the dog in his lap. And it was just so real. They were just two people talking together about the issues that this fellow was up to. Yeah, I don't think we see that all the time in medicine, but I think that's an example. First of all, I don't have a dog, but anyway. So we'll talk in a while, once Naomi has an opportunity to talk more about mutuality. We'll talk about some of the opportunities we have in our community to break down those barriers and to find ways to invite others who are not like us into our lives, and hopefully get an invitation from them to enter into their lives.
We are, not surprisingly, talking longer than we were supposed to. And it is the time that people who want to hear Tony play his amazing music have to leave to do that. And I'm sorry we didn't create a more natural moment for you to go, but please feel free to go hear that amazing music. We're probably going to talk another 10 minutes and then maybe 15 minutes, and then move into conversation. I'm going to say just kind of quickly that I think of mutuality that Sue was just talking about as like the linchpin of engagement. We don't get really engaged with somebody else if we are not experiencing some mutuality. But mutuality is something that humans are pretty good at. People are pretty good at finding commonalities across difference. It's just that in this country, for sure, we don't search for it across class. So people who perceive themselves to be in the same socioeconomic class, when they meet people who have all kinds of other differences from themselves, you know, geographic differences, subcultural differences, etc., find commonalities. That's the first thing they do. They sit down together and start to talk about what they have in common, and the things we have in common across those differences of culture or age or geography or whatever, the things we have in common across those differences come to be a source of pleasure and interest for us, and they draw us to other people. So we're interested in the ways in which, and we're excited by the ways in which we have things in common with people who are in other ways different from us. But we have an enormous inhibition about doing that across class. And that's just something we each need to think about. We need to think on an ongoing basis, I would say, about how to reach out to uninhibitedly talk and get the human pleasure of finding commonality with people we might be otherwise alarmed by the circumstances of. And in the service of moving forward, so yeah. Mm-hmm. Another thing we wanted to ask you to think about was just to take a moment to think about what can you or have you gotten from a mutual interaction? What can be mutual for you in interactions with people across class?
So I don't have a lot to add to that, except to say that I want to share a little story. Some of you have heard me talk about a friend named Harry, a homeless man who lived here in Bennington until he died a year or so ago. He was born into tough circumstances, had a pretty crummy childhood. By the time he was 10, he was drinking beer with his grandfather every afternoon. Grandfather would send him down to the corner store to pick up some beer for him, and Harry would get some for himself. And he had a cousin that he drank with, and he had some good things happen to him in his life. He, in a way that I've never really understood, was able to go off to England, where he studied at Oxford for a couple of years with a pretty amazing group of people, some of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting since the time of Harry's death. And he had an experience that was so far beyond where he was born. He was born into a family of fairly low socioeconomic means. I believe they were stonemasons. And so off he goes to Europe, and he studies at Oxford, and gets to see life in a really, really different way than what he had experienced here at home. And he eventually came home, but as I say, he had started drinking really early. He came home, he had a pretty good life for a while, but kind of went off the deep end, had some DUIs, lost his license, back to transportation. If you don't have a driver's license, you can't go to your job. Anyway, he went into a downward spiral and really, really went through some tough times, including losing part of his foot to frostbite while being out a number of years ago. And he had a wound that wouldn't heal on the bottom of his foot. And so we were involved with Harry at the clinic and tried to advocate for him with the medical system, and it was a real uphill battle. But he was such a good guy. And I see some of you nodding, and you remember he had stories. He could keep you just, he could mesmerize you with his stories of all the stuff that he had done, and his dreams and his aspirations and his poetry. And he was really an incredible person. And at the, I guess you'd say the bottom of his journey, a friend locally made a space for him in her home so that he could live. She had a heated downstairs with a full bath, and she kind of took him in as her kid. He was the same age as her kids, her grown kids. I think he was 48 or 49 when he died. So he was of that age, and she was a good mom, and she did everything for him. Took him to his doctor's appointments, in a world where the rest of the world had given up on this guy. They'd given up on his foot, for example. She took him to doctor's appointments so regularly that his foot healed. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that bliss was interrupted, and again by COVID in a sense, and he ended up back in a motel situation locally, and he died in the motel. And made us all, everybody who knew him, made us really, really sad. But I just have to say that there were times with him when there were moments of bliss, just being with him, just interacting with him. And he's a little crazy. He could, kind of go off. One of my funnest stories of him is when he was living at this friend's house. She has a Alexa in her kitchen. And you tell Alexa what kind of music to play and that kind of thing. And Harry would come up and sit in her kitchen in the morning and he'd, Alexa, play me some jazz. And Alexa would play some jazz. And Alexa, do this, Alexa, do that. But by 2 in the afternoon, because he was drinking, his drug of choice was alcohol. By 2 in the afternoon, his speech was so slurred that Alexa could no longer understand him. But the joy of seeing this friend interpret to Alexa what kind of music. So just all in a way of saying, and this was, I'm not suggesting that anybody should open up their home and bring somebody in. It's a very complicated situation. But there was so much joy in relating to this guy who was up against so much. And I think any of us who had the pleasure of knowing him benefited from it.
I actually thought you were now going to move right
Oh, I can.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So quickly, I'm going to talk about the moral construction of poverty. When I first started working for the Interfaith Council, which is where GBICS came from, basically the program that was in existence was the Interfaith Food and Fuel Fund, which helped people who were in crisis for food and fuel and that kind of thing, to have some cash help and to get them, back on the road. And what I entered into, I would describe, and I know Mary just left, I wish you were here to feed into this, was an interfaith council that was incredibly committed to the work they were doing, but they really saw it as charity or almsgiving, helping out the POA. And that's where, the history of treatment of poor people has come from. There's judgment about people and how they got there, as opposed to, treating them with respect and dignity. And, so some of the things you hear, people are poor due to their laziness, their irresponsibility, their aversion to work, their sexual promiscuity, their stupidity, their criminal inclinations. Or as Ben Carson once said, everybody know who Ben Carson is, Secretary of Health and Housing for Urban Development at one point. He said, something is morally wrong with the poor. But the reality is, we know now, we have science, as I was sharing early on, we have the science that shows what's lacking in people's lives is not about their laziness. It's about the fact that they just don't have enough. They don't have enough food, they don't have enough house over their head, they don't have a car, they don't have a spare tire in the trunk for when they get a flat with a tire. So all in a way of saying that let's throw out this, this moral construction of poverty and replace it with a better understanding of the social structure that Naomi has so beautifully described.
That moral judgment about poverty, of course, goes back to a long ways in our cultural history. In Elizabethan England, when they were constructing their Poor Laws of 1601, they made this distinction between the worthy and the unworthy poor, which sounds sort of barbaric, but actually we still enact that in our welfare policies, that exact distinction, and also we default to it in our judgments of each other and of ourselves often. So I think it's one of the things we have to learn to interrupt. So when somebody else is expressing that kind of judgment that Sue was just explaining so clearly, we have to train ourselves to say, wait a second. Yeah, and when we are thinking it, we have to interrupt it as well. And I want to return briefly to the issue of what people do when they don't have enough, as Sue was just talking about, and so they rely on networks of mutual aid, of reciprocity, right? And again, I know I'm talking about something that everybody here knows about, but it's one of those things I think we need to call into our mind very clearly. We tend to think of this as that absent, the way I framed it before, that absent economic capital in our networks, we rely on networks of reciprocity. But actually, a more accurate way to describe it would be that historically, as industrialization progressed and the accumulation of wealth became something that was broad, and there was a broad middle class developing, bourgeoisie, etc., what happened is that networks of reciprocity were replaced in people's lives by the accumulation of capital. So people stopped needing to rely on each other because they had the money to hire somebody to do it, or they had that, you know, extra spare tire. They had the money for a spare tire, so they didn't have to worry about whether they had a friend who would come pick them up when they got a flat. And as people developed this accumulation of extra resources that enabled them to cut off their ties, as many of our, I don't know, my parents' generation did, I'm sure many of your parents' generations did, gradually lost those ties of reciprocity as they moved into the middle class. From that perspective, those old decisions began to look like bad choices. So if you drop everything you're doing and go to pick up your friend who got a flat tire, you may not make it to work on time and you may lose your job. And it makes perfectly good sense if your main basis is in that network of reciprocity, but it makes no sense from a middle class perspective, right? And I think that those are things that we need to keep in the forefront of our minds as we struggle to make it urgent that we advocate for the reorganization of our tax system, for example. But in the course of it, we are also, as Sue keeps saying, living in a beloved community. We are here with each other, and we need to be finding our ways to each other. So this is where we really wanted to turn it over to them, right? Mm-hmm. We wanted to ask you to talk about both structural and relational things you think of that could be done here and now in this community to reduce, alleviate, or eliminate poverty. So she's going to write, and I'm going to do my teacher thing and call on hands. Alice.
There was an excellent program in the school system in Bennington called Quantum Leap. It was there for many years, and Susan Scorbati and another faculty member from Bennington College started the program. And they developed contracts with low-income families, parents and the kids, and everybody had to agree to the terms of the contract, which was to come to school every day, the kids, all low-income kids. They worked with hundreds and hundreds of these families for years. That program, and all of the kids they worked with, only 2 of them dropped out of school. Only 2 of them, of hundreds and hundreds of poor children. Mm-hmm. That program was just eliminated by the school system in Bennington. Now, I ask you why. Why is that? How could that be when 80% of the kids in Bennington are on free and reduced price lunch? The second thing I just made...
Just worried about that sound. What is that sound?
Oh, maybe it's this
okay,
thing.
good. It's not a gas.
Maybe it's this thing.
I don't know, yes, turn your volume.
I don't need it. I don't need it.
Okay, there we go.
The second thing is, we all know we've been through this horrible pandemic with COVID. And there was an article out recently, an information out recently that told us that our children in our schools are 2 years behind academically. Well, you take a third grade kid, fourth grade kid, 2 years behind. Kids are taught to read in the first and second grade, generally, mostly the second. So now they're in the fourth grade, they're 2 years behind, they're not reading. Education is the most critical thing in getting families out of poverty. No question about it. So I think if we're going to work on things, we better turn to our school system and find out what is going on and see if we can do something to help there.
Thank you.
You want to respond or just keep going?
You want to respond?
No, I don't want to respond.
I don't want to respond either. I
Okay.
think she said
What?
it all.
Yeah.
Well, we can respond.
Who else has something they'd like to offer? Would like this to be a conversation. So ideas about how we can change things.
I don't need that. You know I don't need that.
People who are hard of hearing need it.
I think Cat TV
Right up
needs
to
it.
your,
Okay, I didn't need it.
Really?
I think that talking about quantum leap, I think as a community, we failed our students, that we didn't demand that they keep the program in place. We just laid down and died.
Yep.
I think that as a community, that we need to expect our administrators, our select board, whatever, to step up and help with this housing situation that has gotten desperate. It's been in existence for I don't know how many years, but it just continues and continues. I happened to go through the assessments, and I can't remember exactly how many pieces of property the town owns. Why can't they start at the very least with tiny home communities where they put in the infrastructure? It just occurred to me the other day that when they talk about this TIF with the taxation for infrastructure, and supposedly it brings back the income because you improve the sidewalk, the water supply, the sewer, and if we could have tiny homes for some of these people that are living out behind houses and behind businesses and everything else. If you give somebody a home that they can come home to and have heat, water, and a roof over their head, they will rise to your expectations. We don't expect enough out of our citizens. But at the same token, I personally expect a whole lot more from our leaders. The poverty is here, and sticking your head in the sand is not going to stop it. We need to address it.
Thank you.
Tell us how you
Recently, because
really
I was
feel.
interested in what's going on about policing in the community. I've gone to a couple of select board meetings, and I'm astonished at how few people are there, and how the agenda is set for what takes place at those meetings. And I don't see many of us there, right? And so, talking both about structural and relational ways to change, we have to show up, and we have to be knowledgeable, and we have to be not confrontational with our leaders, but we have to join them. And if there isn't that kind of reciprocity, then we're not going to get anywhere. It's not up to our leaders alone. And as I said, I was just astonished. Tortoise and I and my son went to the first meeting of the review board for the Bennington Police. We were the only 3 people there. There was no one there. And when we walked in at like 5 to 7 or 1 minute to 7 or whatever, they were talking about the fact that nobody showed up. That's not good.
There's one coming this Thursday.
That's right.
So I'm going to respond to that by saying that one of the recommendations I have on my structural list is something I would like to charge the AAUW with. If that came out right, never end a sentence with a preposition. I would like to see the AAUW take on bringing civics back to our high school. Because I think a huge issue is that kids are graduating and they don't have a clue about life. If you ask the average graduate, you know, how is our town run? Ask them about representative democracy. We have some huge deficits. So in that the AAUW has that bent, I'd love to see some pressure brought to see if we can't do that. I will say that the book group that my husband and I belonged to 10 or 12 years ago read The New Jim Crow, and we read The Warmth of Other Suns, which is all about the diaspora of African Americans from the South to the North and the West. And as part of our reading that group, we went to, our book group members are from here and from Williamstown. We went to the two high schools to find out what was being taught about the new Jim Crow. And guess what? Nothing. Nothing at all. But my understanding is that since then, there has started to be some work toward addressing those issues. But again, I don't know who said it, maybe Cindy, we have to show up and we have to put the pressure on.
Wendy has one. Yeah.
Okay, my name's Wendy, and I think that we need to work on the transportation system. There's so many people that, I work at BCIL, and I work with people that can't get to appointments because they don't have transportation. So many people with disabilities are having to walk, where if we had a better transportation system, they could just get on the bus. And so I think that's what we need to work on.
And in the newspaper yesterday, there was an announcement of a meeting at which Green Mountain Express, or whatever our local carrier is called right now, it will be presenting, I believe, to the select board, and they're looking for input from the community about how and whether the local transportation system is meeting the needs of the people in the community. So as Mary Ellen said, we need to show up and say it like it is.
Nancy.
Walter
Okay.
had his hand up and then.
You'll be next.
Yes. We'll make our way down the line.
I have a couple of suggestions. One is that we abandon the education system we've got, which is a dismal failure. Just for the amount of money we spend on it in Vermont, we don't get the results we need. We don't get the workers we need to do the jobs that are available in the community. There are people who come out and can't get jobs and aren't fully prepared. So my suggestion for education is that we go to a cooperative program where kids go in high school year-round, but alternate in their last 2 years, 6 months out working in some kind of a job that's related to something they might want to do when they get out, and then they spend 6 months in school, and they alternate back and forth, which puts money in their pocket, gets them into the real world, gets them some real world working experience, which they can use to go on, gives them a chance to evaluate what jobs in the working world is really like, and some real world experience instead of putting them into this hermetically sealed jar we have till they're 18 and then kicking them out. That's one thing. The other thing is we need to come up with alternative systems to the silly capitalist programs we have that require economic resources to even get on board with basic things. We need to create community programs like for transportation where we have lots of people that have spare cars. Let's create a community carpool that people can buy into for a minimal amount and get out there and borrow a car, use a car, have a car assigned to them, can come back to people who have mechanical skills, who will work on the cars, keep the cars running, provide spare parts, create programs like that in various fields. Teach people how to garden. Teach them how to grow vegetables so they can put food on their table. So much better than buying the stuff that comes in the store, and so much cheaper in the long run. We need to create these various kinds of different community programs that people can come into just because they want to participate and provide their assistance, provide their help, and trade it back and forth in the community with little or no cost to the people that actually need it, so they don't need to buy in with capital that nobody has.
We're just making our way down this way, Alice.
Hi, I was using the Green Mountain Express for a good time because when my husband was ill. And then it got to a point where they were no longer requiring masks, or usually I had to call the day before with COVID symptoms kind of thing. They don't do that anymore. And yet there's still COVID going on, and the flu season is starting up. And these are just basic things that people need to do. And yet and you ask them to have a driver who will wear a mask, but they don't even put it on properly. So these are things that I think are just public health issues that need to be addressed. And I agree with you about the student program. That's kind of like what they did at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and where people did internships. And even when I worked at a job in Philadelphia years ago, there were students coming from the South Philadelphia High School, and they were working in the office that I worked in and getting experience. And those are the kinds of things that are very practical and applicable. And they can go away with references for their future. So those are the kinds of things I think that do need to happen in a community like this that is not vibrant.
Thank you. Nancy, call me and we'll go to the Green Mountain Express meeting together.
Yes.
I'll be your carpool.
Yeah, well, I just was so excited about what he had to say.
Well,
Can you put the mic up to your mouth, please?
I was just so excited about what you had to say, and it completely overshadowed anything I was going to say. But I do remember I worked for OEO way back in the 60s when we brought Head Start in, and that program, we had 4 aides here in Bennington at the time, I being head aide. And we had a nurse, and we had, and this was all through Vermont, all through the United States, and it was under the Poor People's Campaign. And we got the poor involved in the in the evening meetings that are held at the school, wherever, it could be done, as well as we had a building of our own, where we all gathered with cooking classes and things like this. Does somebody else remember this or not? Nobody.
I do very well.
Alice does.
Were you involved? You seem too young, but.
I ran one of the 30 research projects, Head Start follow through in the state.
Were you in
Nationwide,
the
and
first year that
I know
Head
a
Start
lot
was
about
in?
that. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Everything you said.
And OEO is coming back, Brock. It's Brock. We still have that organization, but they don't have any aides or anything anymore, and haven't for years.
So we benefited greatly from the war on poverty. It's a
Absolutely,
stupid
and that
name,
is
but
going on now. They're trying to get that going.
we
That's
have
certainly a
pulled
program.
back on those resources, and our progress has really gone backwards.
And that program is going to get you acquainted with the poor, because you would be involved in helping them get into Head Start or something. You would somehow be involved.
Yeah.
And we still have Head Start, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a place that needs more attention
Okay.
more community attention.
We're closing in on our finish time, so I want to just make sure we get to the last closing thoughts.
May I just say one thing that people might really like to know? You know, Senator Leahy has just retired, and he was the chair of appropriations. He brought more money to Vermont than you can imagine. Thanks to Martha Caldwell in the back, who's a member of yours. Shaftesbury got over $1 million. We brought millions of dollars into the state of Vermont, and in this area, millions. Martha put together a committee that Naomi was also on, and to come up with ideas how people would like to see that money to be spent. In all towns, the select board has the say about how that money is spent. But all of the things you're mentioning here, there's money available to spend it on. Martha, why don't you add something to what I said?
Okay.
I will. I'll speak for the youth.
Thank you.
Although I'm not so youthful anymore, having grown up here. I guess, I have certainly been leaning in a lot more to our community and what we need. And I am a medical professional. I work in the school systems. I work 4 jobs to try to make ends meet here. So certainly a lot of these things are poignant to what we're doing here and what we can do. But I want to, I think, end with, there are so many opportunities here in Bennington County to lean in, however you want to do it. And, I think I'll highlight some of the youth organizations that desperately need people. One of them is the Alliance for Community Transformation, ACT. They are working very hard in the school systems, but also in the community at large, to create places where kids feel like they matter. One of the youth risk behavior survey results for Bennington County is that over half of the kids here don't feel like they matter or that people are rooting for them. And that's a huge number, and it's something that I think all of us can show up for, whether it's going to the performances at the school or getting involved with ACT. We have a lot of kids that are on in LGBTQ spectrum here. We have the Queer Connect, which is working very hard with kids that are identifying with those issues that are coming up in our school system of kind of bullying and some hate crimes that are happening. And there are so many more that if you just kind of look around, there are people that are working on all of these issues, and they all need people. And a lot of them are people like me that are working multiple jobs and fitting it in as best we can. But if we had the energy and the ideas of you and all the wisdom that you bring to the table, it really, I think, will make this community a healthier place, but also the place that we live and we love. And we've lived here and made homes here and lives here. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for recognizing the wisdom in this room. Martha and I had coffee last week, and I accused her of being ageist. So you want to say a final thought? I guess I'll just say on behalf of AAUW, I have no authority to say this, and for the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Bennington, of which I'm a member, thank you all for coming. Naomi is going to give us a 1-minute idea of something we're thinking of doing, of working with the AAUW to bring more conversation on this topic.
Yeah, we're thinking of bringing here a program that has a really unfortunate name, but try to get past it. It's called the Poverty Simulation, in challenges that people regularly face living in poverty, and helps people understand on a real gut level how those bad choices get made. Mary Ellen wanted to.
That could be very powerful. I would really hope that so that could be very powerful, but I really hope that it's not just a group of us doing the simulation of something that's the lived experience of so many others. And if there was a way with organizing it, that people who are experiencing and living in poverty were actually the organizers of it, so that they were showing us, and we were going here saying, we want to know more about what your life is like.
That is actually part of the model, and I just didn't want to take time to explain that. But what we do need is sort of people to volunteer to help us organize it, and it is a model that brings the voices of a spectrum of people from the community into the educational process and works together. So there you go. Thank you all for this wonderful conversation.